Welcome. My name is Georgia Court. I'm the proprietor of Bookstore One Sarasota, and I'm so glad to welcome you all to this evening's conversation between Susannah Marren and Leslie Bennetts. And I will introduce them in a second. But first, here's what we plan to have happen this evening. They will be in discussion. They'll be chatting with each other for 30 minutes or so, a little more, a little less. And once that discussion is over, then we will be opening it up for questions. And I think because we have a small group tonight, what I'll do is just ask those of you who are in the audience, I'll invite you to unmute, and then you can join us live and ask questions. I think that might be the way to do it, since it looks like we're going to be a small, intimate group, although a few more supposedly will be joining us as we go on. Our speakers tonight are Susannah Marren. Am I pronouncing your last name correctly? Great. She's the author of Between the Tides and a Palm Beach Wife, and the pseudonym for Susan Shapiro Barash, who has written over a dozen nonfiction books, including Tripping the Prom Queen, Toxic Friends, and You're Grounded Forever, but First Let's Go Shopping, and I like that title. For over 20 years, she has taught gender studies at Marymount Manhattan College and has guest taught creative nonfiction at the Writing Institute at Sarah Lawrence College. She lives in New York City. Leslie Bennetts is a veteran journalist who began her newspaper career, and wave, Leslie, so people know which is which. I guess I should have said that. Thank you. Who began her newspaper career at the Philadelphia Bulletin, where she won many awards for writing and reporting, and then spent 10 years as a reporter at the New York Times. The first woman ever to cover a presidential campaign for the Times, she also covered metropolitan news, city hall, style, and cultural news, in addition to national politics. Bennetts left the Times for Vanity Fair, where she spent 24 years as a contributing editor and wrote many of the magazine's best-known movie star cover stories, as well as investigative articles on subjects ranging from priest pedophilia to the nation's war against drugs. She started covering so-called women's issues in the 1970s and has continued to write about women, marriage, and families ever since. Please welcome Susannah Marren and Leslie Bennetts, and I will let you two have a wonderful conversation.
Thank you. Thank you, Georgia, for inviting us to your bookstore. Leslie, I'm always so happy to be with you.
Well, I'm delighted to be with you. So can I talk a little bit about how I know you?
Definitely.
I, as a longtime journalist, I'm always looking for people who are smart about the kind of issues that I write about to interview. And when I was about 15 years ago, when I was working, or a little bit less, on my first book, I read a piece in the newspaper that quoted Susan, who was a gender studies professor and extremely smart about gender issues. And I thought, oh my God, this woman really gets it, and I need to talk to her. So I called her up and interviewed her, and she became one of my go-to pieces for my magazine journalism, as well as the books that I write about issues, as you said, involving women and relationships and marriage and families. And after writing many, I guess more than a dozen nonfiction books, Susan began to write novels, which have also continued to be about subjects like this. And I am always very happy to interview Susan, but I'm a little bit tonight feeling as if I have to pick my way through a minefield, because I'm going to have to be trying to interview her about this latest book without spoiling any of the huge surprises that are embedded in it. So I don't want to be responsible for any spoilers. So I'm going to have to pick my way around my knowing what amazing things happen in this plot as it unfolds that people who have not read the novel yet don't know. So I will try not to ruin anything for anyone while doing the book justice. So I think one thing that I can safely say is that issues of you okay? Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Now I can.
Yeah. Okay. This is a novel that takes on some of the most core issues in women's lives, including the meaning of marriage and motherhood, and what it means to think that maybe you won't be able to become a mother when you do want to be a mother, and the incredibly complex and fraught issue of surrogacy. Because I think I'm not spoiling anything by saying that this is a novel about two sisters and their relationship, and the question of whether one of them is willing to serve as a surrogate for the other sister who has been having difficulty carrying a baby to term. And in the course of exploring these issues, Susan takes on a lot of very, very profound issues surrounding them, including which go to the core of women's identities and sense of meaning and purpose in their lives as well as in their relationships. So to start with, Susan, I guess I will, surrogacy is something that we started to become aware of a couple of decades ago, and I think most people with a passing familiarity with the news know that there have been some famous lawsuits because people's feelings change during this very emotionally loaded process, and the outcomes aren't always exactly what they anticipated that they would be. How did you decide to, and why, to get into to choose this as the subject for your next novel?
Well, I've long been very interested in it. And years ago, I wrote a book on sisters. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Called Sisters Devoted or Divided. And one of the chapters was about an infertile sister asking her sister to be either the carrier or even to be a carrier and to donate her egg to this for a child to be born. And it was an intriguing notion, and my publisher at the time was so happy with that and so interested in it that I did a whole book for them that never came out, which can happen on occasion, about infertility and gestational carrier. And I saw that the bioethics back in the 90s were really a very serious issue, and quite honestly, they still are today. So while the science works very well, there are really ethical issues surrounding it. I wanted this story to take place in Palm Beach. It's the second in a series of Palm Beach novels, because Palm Beach is such a beautiful, rarefied place, not very diverse, as we know, but with great privilege and a lot of money in a capitalistic society. And so you would think that sisters who are raised there and have a mother who's the sort of it mother around town, an it girl, would have everything they need. So when Elodie, the 40-year-old sister, finds that she can have a baby, I really wanted her sister Aubrey, who's very, as you know, footloose and fancy free, to have to face what this would do and what surrogacy is really about.
Of course, surrogacy is very easy for people who have not born a child to be cavalier about this, but it's it's no small thing to create another human being inside your body and give birth to it. And it is, as you and I both know, being mothers, only the beginning of a process that never ends for the rest of your life of being a mother. and I find that with, as you have, I have millennial children who are grown up and on their own, but the challenges of being a parent to grown up children are, are just as challenging as the ones with younger children, although they may be different. So, the book is an interesting sort of window into that. Has always fascinated me that I think it's 80-something% of all American women are eventually mothers, eventually one way or another. What is your view? You've been covering women's lives for a long time, and you've done an unusual amount of research over the decades of interviewing all kinds of women in all kinds of situations all over the country. To what extent do you think that the role of motherhood in women's lives has changed or evolved over, let's say, the last 20 or 30 years? Is it different now?
I think it has evolved, and I think it remains the same. I think that the glittering prizes for women in our culture have been taught to us for a very long time. The idea that you will be the good daughter who becomes the good wife, the good mother, the good grandmother, particularly with longevity, and that, of course, the other piece of the pie is that you get to have a great career, although no equal pay for equal work. So, as sorry as that is. So the trajectory of the female life for the last 50, 60 years remains pretty much the same. Are you entitled to be single by choice, as is Aubrey, the younger sister, the 32-year-old sister in my novel? Yes, of course you are. And that's kind of a new aspect of the female experience. But I do think that there is societal pressure still to be married, to have a child or two or three, to be fulfilled. That is still some kind of prescribed situation for women.
What I see as a reporter and just as a person, knowing a lot of millennials through my kids, it's not so much pressure as it is that it is a signifier of success. And I find a lot of young women in their 20s and 30s, if they haven't got their personal lives sort of nailed down in a conventional way, that they have a partner who then becomes a husband and a child or children by a certain age, they're afraid they are seen as not successful, even if they're, a tech entrepreneur who's made up hundreds of millions of dollars. It's still this essential criterion for success that is applied, it seems to me, to women and not to men, which I think your characters are grappling with also, aren't they?
They really are. And for Elodie, the older sister, who has a great career in Palm Beach, she runs the fictive Palm Beach Literary Society and a really nice marriage. She is feeling as if she's failed. She feels as if she's incomplete because she doesn't have the child. And she, as you describe it, looks at her friends, and they do. And this is the missing piece, again, in this perfect town where perfection is easy to come by. And so she's in a desperate situation, which is never good for anyone, when she asks her sister Aubrey. But what is also a pretty big part of the story is, who are these two sisters to each other? And then their mother is really in a triangle, because as mothers, we know that we want everything to be just so with our children. And the mother, Veronica, who of course has her own ghosts in the closet, is someone who really doesn't know which daughter to support when all the tension begins. And Aubrey, the daughter who is single, really has to question if her life has enough value to say no to her sister. So that's the first part of the book. And then, of course, it's a story within a story, because once Aubrey agrees, no spoiler here, that's all I'll say, it opens up Pandora's box for this family.
As these kinds of fraught decisions so often do.
Exactly.
One of the things that is implicit in your story, as it is in so many women's lives, is that, really strikes me listening to you talk about it right now, is the extent to which women are socialized to feel that they have to sacrifice their own interests or wishes or goals or whatever, in a selfless way for someone else, whether it's their husband or for the family unit, or in this case for a sister or whatever. And, these days with the pandemic, I keep reading headlines every day about, there was a piece in the New York Times today about women, I think it was in the retail sector, can't go back to work because they're home and they have to take responsibility for homeschooling their kids if their kids can't go back to school because of COVID. And one woman was quoted as saying, well, my husband is home all day, but he just doesn't really step up to the plate. So this poor woman, who's the breadwinner, is caught between a rock and a hard place because, as you and I certainly know, even women who are the major breadwinner in the family are still doing 2/3 of the domestic drudge work and childcare in typical American households. So what was you really got into the question of female self-sacrifice. I mean, you didn't, spell it out or hit us over the head with it, but it's kind of embedded in this whole story, isn't it?
Yes, definitely what we do to survive. I would call this a book about survival on some level for each of the women. And it was very important to me that we looked at the mother carefully too, because I want my books to always be multi-generational, because I always want women over a certain age to have enough voice. That really means a lot to me. And apropos of what you're saying about what we would call the second shift, that it's never really been taken fairly into consideration by both parties in a marriage. When Elodie decides to have this baby, of course they can afford a nanny, but when she decides to to go for a surrogate and to please her husband, the question becomes and I was thinking of it when you described this article today about a couple, how much do we give up of ourselves in any situation because we're female?
Right, and in your book, one of the things is, you talked a lot about the mother and the relationship between the two sisters, but there is intense pressure from the husband. He expects his wife to fulfill this role, and, pressure to please him is a big part of it as well. Male expectations here, right?
Yes, and I've written 3 books on the role, 3 different studies for my nonfiction under my real name for the role of wife in America. And it's both endlessly fascinating and concerning on some level, because women hold the bar so high. That would be perhaps a criticism or a view of how wives feel, that they want their husbands to be best friend, lover, confidant, everything rolled up into one. But in a patriarchal culture, Leslie, men aren't conditioned to have that many tricks up their sleeve, if you will. And so what happens is that in this story, James, the husband, and he's a real catch in terms of being successful and well-educated and good-looking, and he loves his wife, and he wants to have a beautiful home. These are the prizes for him as a male, a 40-year-old man in our society. And so James expects that his wife will hear his need. And she has more trouble explaining her ambivalence. And that always gets us into trouble when we don't have enough voice. So I'm really looking at these 2 sisters and their mother. And of course we have a mother-in-law in the story because, right, I've done a whole study on mothers-in-law and daughters-in-law. So James's mother also has her own agenda. And how do women get what they need when, as you said earlier, they're often put in a position of sacrifice? And then,
I think one of the things that you're also looking at in this novel is something that I've always found a lot in my reporting work as well. You know, in order to get your needs met, first of all, you have to identify what they are. And sometimes it is very difficult if you have been heavily socialized into female norms to separate out the question of what you as a unique individual might actually want that might diverge from the blueprint, the cultural blueprint we're all presented with for what a female life is supposed to be. And Elodie, your main character, certainly is grappling with that because, you know, you hit 40, and in her case, she found the perfect, you know, Mr. Right. She's married, she has this enviable life, but she hasn't managed to have a baby. And so therefore, she feels as if she's failed, and you know, she is dealing with the disappointment of everybody from her mother to her husband to her mother-in-law to, you know, the culture around her. So my question to you as Susan Shapiro Barish, the gender studies expert, is over all of these years that you've been studying women's lives, how much liberation is there? To what extent have we managed to free ourselves to figure out what our own needs are in as distinguished from the cultural prescription?
I'm listening to you and I'm thinking that it's still very hard for women. Based on my research for a book called The New Wife, The Evolving Role of the American Wife, a book that actually met over, right, in 2004. And I've kept that research going. The millennial wife, the millennial daughter, can often have much more voice than her mother did. But she also feels entitled in a way as a reaction to her boomer mother, who in many cases, say over 50%, ended up divorced, hit a glass ceiling despite all her hard work, and probably missed one of her daughter's ballet recitals or gymnastics events, at least one, because she had to work and she had to be at the office. And so the pendulum swings, and young women, and that would be Aubrey in this book because she's 32. So the millennial daughter is saying, why do I have to replicate my mother's life? Where did it get her? And really questioning that. And at the same time, if she does marry, then she feels, then once she steps over that line, she feels very much as though it has to be conventional. So a lot of the basic expectations still remain. And I thought that that was fascinating. And another part of this book was that I was looking at the parents' marriage. And although they have children, it's really a very couple-centric marriage. And so I'm asking the reader to think about why marriage and raising a family, and we're always so involved with our adult children, as you mentioned before, why there's some kind of hierarchy to it. As if women are always, if life is a pie, the pieces of pie are really dictated more than that we create them as we want, that we feel so beholden to our partners and our husbands, because that's another aspect of the novel. The template of a good wife.
Yeah. So liberation is still a work in progress.
Oh, totally.
But before we open this up to questions, I just wanted to ask you one more thing, given the title of the book and where you've chosen to set it in Palm Beach. As a New Yorker, I was, you know, I've been fascinated by your portrayal of this particular cultural milieu, and I will just share with our listeners that a couple of days ago we were talking on the phone, and you said, well, you know, it really could be anywhere. It doesn't need to be Palm Beach. I don't think these things are unique to Palm Beach. And I said, gosh, I found this to be, you know, I mean, I know we're talking to people who are in Florida, but in a very different part of Florida than Palm Beach. So what I experienced reading this novel, and also the preceding Palm Beach novel of yours, I felt sort of like an anthropologist, you know, on a field trip to, you know, an exotic, observe an exotic tribe in like Papua New Guinea or something, because, you know, the sort of cultural and social mores of this place, which, you know, to me, you know, I mean, I meant to count, and I didn't count how many sort of designer names appeared on the first page of the book. You know, it is, although you're very, you know, you have a light touch. It's very deft. It's not a heavy-handed, but this is an extremely materialistic culture that you're portraying, very oriented towards conspicuous consumption and, you know, frankly, wealth. And these are also very fraught subjects in a year like this, you know, when there's a tremendous amount of focus on income inequality and the feelings of the haves and the have-nots, and a lot of conflict. What was your, to what extent did you feel that you were satirizing this particular cultural environment? Were you just portraying it? Do you intend, what do you intend for our takeaway to be? Because as I said, I felt like you know,
it's a Margaret Mead of
pith help, you know, in the jungle.
Right, like Margaret Mead, really taking a look at it. Well, I'm definitely portraying the place, and my parents were residents there for many decades, and I was always intrigued with how everyone had so much, and yet so many people seemed unhappy or troubled, or the idea for women of all different ages, social strata, ethnicity, race, religion, area of the country with whom I've spoken, the emotional issues for women, Leslie, are everywhere. It really doesn't matter if you have an MBA from Harvard, or your husband is a hedge fund person, or you didn't finish college. If you're unhappy with your daughter, if you're having fertility issues, if you're having an affair, because I've taken a look at female infidelity, if your mother-in-law is a problem, or one of your children is troubled, that if these are the emotional issues for women. And so even though Palm Beach is trickier because everything is supposed to be so perfect and rarefied, if we look at women, as I have anywhere, there are always social pressures. There are oftentimes clans and cliques. And so if you belong wherever you are, you will feel judged, especially if you're having a problem having a baby, especially if your husband is someone who's a philanderer. Whatever the story, wherever you are, there will be talk and judgments. And that's something that women do wherever they go.
Well, thank you. This has been wonderful. I think we still have Stephen with us, and we have a couple people on the line. Any comments or questions from our audience? I think you are unmuted.
Hi, hello. So, what else is the Palm Beach scandal about?
What else is it about?
Yes, it's interesting. I like the name.
Thank you.
And the animations on the book.
This novel is a story about the sister's bond, the mother-daughter bond. It's a story about secrets and lies and how they play out. It's a story about two sisters and what their moral fabric really is once they're put to the test. It's a story of what it's like to live in Palm Beach as your life seems to be not what you really believed it to be. And the idea of luxury versus what the truth will do to you, what actually money can't buy. And of course, it's about baby lust. It's about the role of wife. It's about loyalty. Those are the ingredients in this book.
You know,
Plus beautiful book animations.
one thing that I wonder about too is with the recent death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg and all that she did for equality, both of men and women. With her death and possible changes, are you, some of these roles, I'm wondering if they're going to revert to the women's roles of the 1940s or 50s. You have any thoughts on that?
Well, both Leslie and I can speak to that. Leslie, do you want to go first? Because we have, I mean, we're bereft.
Yes.
You know, what we've seen in recent decades was women's increasing participation in the workforce. And the first book that I wrote, for which I interviewed Susan, was a response to what was called the opting out movement, which was a lot of women suddenly quitting the workforce to stay home and take care of their children, but not realizing that they would be penalized for the rest of their lives, that the workforce as it was then constituted, they were not going to be able to waltz back into good jobs and resume their careers. And so then immediately after the publication of that book, we had the crash of '08 and the recession. And so there's been a tremendous amount of volatility in the last dozen years around these issues. And the reality of modern life is that it takes two incomes to support a middle-class life for most people in most places in America. And right now, one of the things that remains to be seen is what the long-term effects of the pandemic are going to be, because a lot of women are having, a tremendous problem right now because there's a lot of pressure to go back to work. They don't want to lose their jobs, but how do you go back to work if your kids can't go back to school and you're supposed to be supervising their homeschooling and you don't have a free tech consultant at home to supervise them? I mean, somebody's got to be with them. So all of this, we have a very imperfect system in this country we've basically relied on unpaid female labor to take care of, childcare and a lot of family management. And it's just all caught up with us because unlike, for example, the Scandinavian countries and some other Western industrialized nations, we have done a relatively poor job of providing for the needs of families, and it caught up with us because of the pandemic. So right now, it's anybody's guess as to what is going to happen going forward. Because if America's women have to drop out of the labor force because we have not figured out childcare or, schooling or a whole bunch of other things, health care among them, the economy cannot recover because American families are now dependent on women's labor and a function. I mean, the majority of the essential workers during the pandemic have been female, certainly in the healthcare professions. So as a society, we are now facing some massive challenges with a staggering lack of national leadership around developing solutions. And it's anybody's guess where we're going to be a year or 2 years or 5 years from now. Susan?
I feel always that while great opportunities have come to women in the last 50 years, maybe a little less, but definitely since the second wave of feminism, that until, and Leslie's heard me say this so much, until there is equal pay for equal work, there never will be equality in a capitalistic society. And I think that, as Leslie says, now with the virus and as Georgia said, with Ruth Bader Ginsburg no longer with us, the steps backward are so easy. They're so easy, and the steps forward are so much harder for women. And I've read several essays recently about women who say, I had a great job and then my kids were have to stay home, and I'm now the nanny, the house, the chef, the housekeeper, and where is my husband? So I've also read those essays. And I really think that we're not evolved enough to have the skills that we need for what's ahead. And I think that I know that in writing this book, one of the major questions for me was, even in beautiful Palm Beach, what does it take for a woman to really be okay? And what is it about us that we can't always be awake enough to know it, because we're so socialized to do the right thing, the price of the good girl.
Right, exactly. Well, this has been wonderful. If there's no further comments, Stephen has hung in with us while the others have departed after the presentation, but we really appreciate your being with us tonight, Susan and
Thank you so
Leslie.
much.
It has been wonderful. And unless there are other questions or comments, we will say good night.
Good night.
Thank you for having us.
Good night. And Susan and Leslie, let me ask you one final question.